Well, we seem to have done a very useful summary table of these different market forms and their characteristics and their efficiency characteristics as well. But I suggest at the end of that video that we look a little bit at the role of government, because we've actually discussed, as we've gone along, we've been discussing the role of government. And probably most useful if we just go through each market form and just summarize and effectively do a chat summary table of where the government was involved. For instance, in pure competition.
In pure competition, we saw a couple of examples. Governments can intervene and put a price ceiling on a product, so a cap below equilibrium, and we saw straight away that distorts the market balance. So the quantity supplied falls and the quantity demanded rises, so there's that persistent shortage. Yeah. So if the government needs to address that, they need to have plan B up their sleeve and perhaps devote even more of their own resources towards subsidising or importing to make up the deficit.
Yeah, absolutely, so yes.
We actually concluded it wasn't a great outcome, really.
Really. And in fact, it's really implying something about productive and allocative efficiency, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yes.
And
then you move to...
We saw it with the wool industry,
yeah,
or agricultural products, where they put in a support price or a price minimum or a floor price. And basically they created this massive surplus.
Oh yeah.
So there's another misallocation, basically, so that the market forces that were achieving that market balance, which we've identified as being productively and allocatively efficient in pure competition, are actually prevented from operating.
Oh, and I remember reading recently about subsidies in Europe. Yeah. Which, in the milk industry, for instance, where the farmers had such a surplus of milk that they used it to irrigate their lands.
Exactly.
And it's incredible.
And at the opportunity cost when you start, but again, there's that marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis that we need to apply. So governments, we don't want to point a finger at them too much by saying this is terribly wrong. They've appraised the situation and said, well, there are some benefits for us doing this. So there's an equity thing, there's a distribution thing, and governments have that political ideology role.
Yeah.
So,
and in a sense, it points to one of the problems of the underlying assumptions. You remember, incomes are given in pure competition, and once the price is determined, then the income distribution, the people who can afford, let's say, rice, if the price goes up, they no longer can afford it. And so governments may think, this is socially not very desirable to have a price that's too high, and so they put the price ceiling on it.
But then we see the need for government to actually raise revenue by imposing taxes, and we know straight away that the consumer will have to pay the higher price, and particularly if the price elasticity of demand is low, the consumer wears the lion's share of that burden.
Absolutely.
So it poses questions. Well, is that fair?
Is that fair? But then, of course, if it's cigarettes, then of course people will argue that
totally justified.
Totally justified, because it's pushing up the price and cutting back consumption. So, and also maybe the government takes the tax and funds the hotel beds that the cancer victims from smoking actually take up. So there are justifications.
There are justifications, and of course the market structure where we see one of the most obvious public faces of government is the ACCC. In our case, the Consumer Watchdog in Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumers Commission, and where they're trying to promote a more competitive outcome in markets where the market structure lends itself towards either collusion, either tacit collusion.
Exactly, in the imperfectly competitive part of our spectrum.
Exactly.
The monopolistic competition, the oligopoly and the monopoly.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's a role for government there as to prevent anti-competitive behaviour, and also prevent collusion and those sorts of things, and also to promote competition.
Yes.
All right. And
even with the monopolist, we find that there's a need for them to perhaps intervene or insist upon certain regulatory changes in prices that they deem are equitable, so that there's a fair price strategy.
Yes, and that's most clearly the case in electricity pricing, power, because power is so pervasive as a cost of production in industry.
And the rising costs impact upon every member of society, rich and poor.
Yes.
So
you don't want to have some monopolist sort of saying, "Ooh, I'd like to make some more profits," and he's got to justify that in terms of a rising cost.
That market structure where you've got that potential for what you and I sometimes call the rip-off factor, where you can charge a stinkingly high price because you can.
Yes.
And if the price elasticity of demand is low, mate, bad luck.
Bad luck, exactly.
And the supernormal profit rectangle, if you can envisage that, just shoots off the chart.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So now, there was we in imperfect competition we had those functions for government. We also looked at market spillovers or externalities, and we saw that the price that the final consumer pays of the product sometimes does not embed the true cost of the production, or in fact the true benefit in some cases. So what's the role for the government there?
The role for the government is basically to correct what we call the market failure. So in the case of a cost externality, because we're actually over allocating resources in a conceptual sense to the actual level of production, the government can impose the levy or the tax which actually forces the firm to internalise the cost as opposed to externally basically getting a freebie. So they can force them to do that,
yeah.
But that requires legislation. Of course, there's that political problem because the lobby groups have become a factor.
because when they impose the tax, the company passes it on higher costs.
They do.
A higher price.
They do.
So the higher price along the demand curve implies less consumption. So we end up, say, with higher electricity price, we consume less electricity, therefore we have less pollution.
And with regards to the benefit externality, there's that role, as we saw, that the government can provide either a subsidy to the producer or to the consumer. It'll achieve the same outcome, a win-win basically. Yeah. A market price that's actually effectively higher, but by the time the consumer pays it, actually lower.
Yes.
So they're an important role in terms of the externalities, and of course the biggest market failure of all, that's the most evident one, is of course public goods.
Of course.
And we've got that void that exists with respect to the provision of infrastructure items that we know are crucial to the economic functioning of our society, for the smooth functioning of the economy.
Yes.
So our transport networks, our communications networks, of course the provision of law and order and public safety, defence, etc., etc. So very, very significant role for government to play.
But of course there's a bit of a grey area there too, isn't there, depending on the political colour of the government, that in some governments would push for a lot of public education, for instance, or public health.
Yes, and less money on defence.
Less money on defence, whereas
another right-wing leaning government might do the opposite.
Do the opposite, exactly, and argue the market should provide private schools, private health, etc. So those we saw, we called quasi-public.
Quasi-public goods.
Quasi-public.
And you know, we've just had an election here, and you would have known that in that lead-up to the election, one of the major platforms or areas of discussion was what both political parties call economic management, which I find a bit odd, quite frankly, because we don't manage a laissez-faire or market-based economy, remember?
The invisible hand.
But exactly right. But there is a role for government to play in what we know to be the macroeconomic economy.
Yes.
So
no, we haven't done that yet.
No, but I think we need to actually address the fact that what the politicians refer to as fiscal and monetary policies and changes in interest rates, etc., and budget surpluses and budget deficits have an impact upon the overall economy.
Yes, and in fact have an overall impact upon what we call the business cycle, on inflation, unemployment,
Yes.
and these topics we have not really discussed so far. So we need to set the context for fiscal and monetary policy, and then in later videos we need to talk about what they do.
We should do that. We should make that jump.
Absolutely.
All right, mate.